Hey, good morning. It's Friday. We're frozen to death, and neither are you. I mean, and so are you, or not, as the case may be. Welcome to a Frigid Friday. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. Lots going on in the world. Don't even know where to begin. So let's jump in to Eagle Pass.
This is so mind blowing. Look at this comment from Julian. Eating chocolate and watching my favorite podcast with a U in favorite, which I like, on a warm summer night in Sydney.
Okay, Julian, rub it in. But in Fahrenheit, what's the temperature? It's not too bad in New England this morning. I popped in the car. I thought, hey, this isn't so bad. 25, 26 degrees. This after nights in the low teens, a little bit colder up in northern Vermont. But hey, it's winter up over. If you're down under, we're up over. But we're not in Eagle Pass. And the Eagle Pass, the Eagle Pass situation looks to me like this could become as significant a constitutional event as the shelling of Charleston as the prelude to the Civil War. Maybe I overstate it somewhat, but not by much, because here's what's at stake at Eagle Pass. Again, consider the mystery of government. Ye regular readers of our newsletter know what I'm talking about. Somehow, if you were to zoom out and take a look at planet Earth from some distance in space, you'd see this sphere. And as you approach it and zoom in, you see all this activity and people, and then you begin to discern patterns and how they react and interact with one another. And the closer, and at some point, 30, 40,000 feet in the air, you'd marvel that we appear to be organized in clusters or communities. The closer in you get, and the closer in you get to your own heart, that heart of darkness, you realize just how tenuous the entire enterprise is, and how marvelous the rule of law is, and how amazing it is that there are communities at all. And you see at the perimeters of every society means to maintain some implicit sense of order. Thus, the criminal code, or thus civil tort or rules of contract. You don't know all the people that you depend on. You'll never meet most of them, but you rely on them through relationships of trust, and those relationships of trust are mediated, managed, and maintained through the rule of law. And I realize that sounds like an advertisement for law school, but that's the bottom line. And you can argue with this until your teeth fall out, or until your hair is grayer than mine, if you have the good fortune to live that long, or the bad genes to go gray young. But the fact of the matter is, the rule of law is a mystery, and it's what holds societies together. It's not perfect, and it can break down. And what makes a particular set of rules distinguishable from another are the overarching principles that hold them together. And in the United States, those overarching principles come in the form of a federal constitution, which is overlaid, which is superimposed on a people prepared to accept it as legitimate for any of a number of reasons. And we explore them all from time to time. The current constitutional regime in the United States revolves around a concept called federalism, and it revolves around another concept called separation of powers. In fact, I'd go so far to say that the three pillars of our constitutional system on which the entire enterprise depends are the federalism, separation of powers, and the Bill of Rights. And these pillars support an ad hoc governance of the world that balances the interests of all the people affected by various rules. So zoom in now to Eagle Pass, Texas, a crossing on the Rio Grande. Consider from that 40,000-foot view of humankind on Earth the influx of migrants along the southern border right now. I don't know if it's unprecedented in American history. It may be, and there are those who suggest it is. I'm not enough of a scholar or student of immigration patterns, but I know that what we have is more people flowing into Texas than Texas can cope with. It is overwhelming the ability of the government of the state of Texas to provide for the health, education, safety, and welfare of people in those communities. And so the government of Texas, having under federalism the police power, That is the primary responsibility to assure the health, education, safety, welfare, and morals of its people, are seeking to, the state of Texas, rather, is seeking to enact regulations that give it some ability to control its borders. Because if you've got more people coming into a state than that state can accommodate, does that state have a right to say no mas? And arguably it does. Maybe it doesn't. From a moral perspective, maybe we should say all people are like information. They just want to be free, and everybody's got an obligation to accommodate strangers howsoever they arrive. You can find religious traditions that will talk about that. But as a matter of law, Texas has made a policy decision. We want border integrity. In comes the Border Patrol, the Department of Border Patrol, the Department of Homeland Security, immigration officials, and they say, but wait, the federal Constitution gives to Congress the right to create uniform rules of naturalization. That's what the Constitution says. So as a matter of federalism, the power to determine who becomes a citizen belongs to the federal government. That's not a state power.
If I can, I'll read from the January 14th cease and desist letter sent from one Jonathan E. Meyer, the General Counsel for Homeland Security. He wrote to Attorney General Ken Paxton in Texas and said in relevant part, quote, "The U.S. Constitution tasks the federal government with regulating immigration. The government of the United States has broad undoubted power over the subject of immigration and the status of non-citizens and securing the nation's borders. Among other things, federal law unambiguously grants Border Patrol agents the authority without a warrant to access private land within 25 miles of the international border, as well as to interrogate and arrest anyone who in their presence or view is entering or attempting to enter the United States in violation of any law and is likely to abscond. Federal law deems those who are present in the United States without having been admitted or paroled applicants for admission with certain statutory rights. It provides for federal officials to inspect such applicants and authorizes federal agents to arrest and detain non-citizens pending removal decision. Texas's actions conflict with these statutory authorities and are improper attempt to regulate the federal government. State law cannot be applied to restrain federal agents from carrying out these federally authorized activities." And it then goes on to say that Texas's actions are clearly unconstitutional and are actively disrupting the federal government's operations, that we demand that Texas cease and desist its efforts to block Border Patrol's access in and around the Shelby Park area and remove all barriers to access in the Shelby Park area.
All right, so that that's fine on its face. And if I were Ken Paxton, I'd said, I read your letter. Good. I'm glad you recognize the authority that you have to do your job protecting our borders and to remove illegals. Get off your ass and do the job. We're here because you won't.
And this is what I have on the screen from Kim
No,
Paxton.
I understand that. But here's the deal. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would have responded that way. But here's the deal. Congress, the federal Constitution gives Congress the power to enact laws regarding naturalization. Regulation in Section 4 of Article 4 of the United States Constitution gives to the federal government the responsibility to protect states against invasion. Now, whether this mass influx of migrants is an invasion within the meaning of the law, you begin to understand why people use that term, because they're trying to score rhetorical points to force the government's hand. But here's the issue. If the federal government has the Fourth Amendment limits its reach to so-called border searches within 100 miles of the border. Federal agents can stop a person on reasonable suspicion, not with if they think they're an illegal immigrant. But if the federal policy is for open borders, if federal law says, look, we have this power, but we're not going to use it because our policy choice is to open the borders, does that mean that Texas can't act because it has its own independent rights and responsibilities to assure the police power? I think this is a constitutional crisis of a fundamental nature. That could support a movement for something like secession, which is why I began this segment talking about the bombing of Charleston. Texas, I think, has a right to say to the federal government, you are not honoring your responsibility to help us do our job, which is to protect our citizenry. Therefore, we're going to do it. And if your policy is to say we'll have open borders and we don't like it because of our police power responsibilities, we're not going to go along. Now, in the end, I think the Supreme Court, when this issue reaches the Supreme Court, as it will within a year or two, the Supreme Court will nod in the direction of the federal government almost certainly. And that will create enormous pressures and resentments in Texas. And I'm not sure where that goes. So it's an inflection point. I think people should pay attention to it. Read up on it, show us what you can find in it. I think it's an example of the tensions that exist within our constitutional order involving federalism. The Congress is the supreme law of the land, but yet the state's retention of police powers. And when a state reaches a considered judgment that the exercise of a limited federal power undermines the health, education, and welfare of people in that state, what are the responsibilities of the state government? Are they to roll over and play dead and say, okay, Uncle Sam, we'll be swamped in your honor? I don't think the answer is yes. I think they get to fight back.
So here is in part Ken Paxton's response to the cease and desist letter, and you'll love this. It's towards the end. He says, according to your letter, quote, the U.S. Constitution tasks the federal government with securing the nation's borders. When were you planning to start?
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that is right there. That should be the head of that should be the caption of the story. Memo to feds: when were you planning to start doing your job? So
That's right.
Let's keep an eye on that. It's a very, very, very interesting. Jamaal Bowman is. He's got ambitions, and Jamaal Bowman and others have introduced a House resolution saying it's just time to acknowledge our responsibility to pay reparations to people of color. We've got a little theme music for Jamaal. Ready?
Oh, here we go. You caught me off guard.
Well, I waited long enough to see a sign of recognition in your face, but I guess the caffeine hasn't kicked in there.
Can you hear it, Norm?
Yeah. Yeah, well, you may not have heard the theme song from the, George Jefferson. Moving on up to a deluxe apartment in the sky. Moving on up, we finally got a piece of the pie. On Bowman, reparations, I view as a clear and present danger to our constitutional order, because the theory is, apropos the 1619 project, that when the first 20 slaves were brought over from Africa to the United States and implanted, or to the colonies, and implanted on American soil, that became the seed from which slavery grew. And slavery was a festering wound in the American body politic until it was abolished in the 1860s. And the result of slave labor made possible big cotton and profits, enormous profits for plantations, and enormous profits for those in the North who traded the cotton to England in exchange for manufactured goods and services. And without slavery, the United States, it is argued, would not have been as prosperous as it was and is. And therefore, Jamaal Bowman says, the legacy of slavery requires the United States to acknowledge its historic injustice and requires the United States to pay current African American money for the purposes of racial equity. On Bowman's view, all 42 million, each and every one of those 42 million African Americans in the United States should receive a check from the federal government in the amount of $333,000. So if you're a family of three and Bowman gets his way, you get a check for $1 million, and you're moving on up, right? Now, whatever inflationary pressure this might have on the price of goods and services, who knows? But who's going to pay for all that? I mean, we're already in debt as a nation, and our national debt is historic. Just last night or yesterday, I believe Congress passed another resolution to prohibit a shutdown of the government in March, because we just can't seem to agree on how to manage the debt that we have and what to pay for it. But Bowman doesn't care. Just start cutting the checks, he says, and we'll grow our way into prosperity. Jamaal. George Jefferson, I think, ran a dry cleaning shop, and at least he had some some insight into how to engage, manage, and cultivate a successful enterprise. What do you got other than a case of gimme-itis? And Jamaal, here's a message to you. I'm not paying him, period. I am not ignorant of history. I'm a student of history, as are all the listeners on this show. But I know that there are more slaves in the world right now, according to the World Slavery Institute, than there were ever in the United States in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century. I know that history is a tragic enterprise. I know that all of us are broken in the end by time, and that every one of our ancestors made compromises with the world that they encountered, some of our ancestors doing better than others. But the notion that I'm supposed to get out of bed tomorrow morning and write you a check with my tax dollars, or have my interactions on every level with the external world taxed for the benefit of people who I never harmed, is repulsive to me. And it's a form of psychological slavery that suggests that in the master-slave relationship that Hegel wrote about, the African Americans remain slaves, remain dependents. You were brought here against your will. Your ancestors were enslaved. Jim Crow, yada 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 yada. So what's the response? Gimme? You want to remain a perpetual dependent? I just can't do it. And candidly, if ever there were a notion that would effectively lead me to doubt the ongoing nature of our collective enterprise, it would be reparations. Because at the moment, I'm told that because of how I was born, I owe someone something. For the rest of my life, I'm required to pay damages, as it were, to those who I don't even know. I begin to feel like that's a new form of subjugation, and it's driven largely by a sort of demographic trick. We got the votes, so pay us. In Machiavelli, we've talked about this before, and I'm sorry to be tedious, but I realize not every one of you listens every day, so repetition has the ability to get the message out. Machiavelli wrote a very interesting book called his Discourses on Livy's History of Rome. He wrote it when Italy was a series of fractured republics and was trying to come together as a larger entity. And he said, how did the Roman Empire get built? And the Roman Empire got built by incorporating communities into a larger whole. And there are two methods of doing that. One, Rome could acquire the allegiances of the local elite in a community and thereby incorporate that community into its empire. Second, they could just move. They could just remove the people who were in power and replace them with their own. And he said those kinds of movements, those replacement movements, are always violent. And I view the reparations struggle as a form of psychological violence. I'm simply not prepared to say that in the United States of America, we should have race-based transfer payments. And so Mike and I have called before, and we'll renew our call again, for an open discussion about a constitutional amendment to ban race-based transfer payments. And Jamaal Bowman is exhibit number 1 and why it's necessary. This jackass thinks that it's okay to say, let's assume another, what was it again? $13 million debt when we can't pay the $1 trillion debt, when we can't even pay the bills that we have now. And let's just start passing money out to people because of how they look. And if you look differently, then you'll pay it. And this is what supports the kind of chatter we get from Joy Reid, who goes off on a toot and says, well, of course I would vote for Trump. It's 61% white Christians, as though white Christians are something that need to be erased, or is it harnessed, or is it enslaved, or is the new class of zombies going to say we're going to revolt until we can hook up your bodily fluids into our life support system? Reparations are a form of cancer, frankly. And until that cancer is driven from the body politic, we're going to have nothing but entitlement and claims to rage. Mike, you're scrolling through.
I'm scrolling
through this.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through the House Resolution 414. This was originally introduced in May of last year, and this is a version of what is being used. The resolution is basically a bitch list, if to be very frank and crass about it. But it is sort of a chronological history of slavery at all in the Americas, and it uses the popular date point of 1619, which we've come come to be familiar with over the past several years, and just goes through the history of, for example, whereas the nation's first 12 presidents, 10 enslaved black people, whereas infant mortality rates on plantations were incredibly high. From 1801 to 1862, the amount of cotton picked daily by an enslaved person increased by 400%, whereas 1861, the value placed on cotton produced by enslaved black people was $250 million, or more than, I guess, $8.2 billion today. I think, Norm, I found something earlier that I was reciting to you here toward the bottom that I just thought was sort of mind blowing, that anybody would take these things seriously in terms of some sort of justification or mandate to support reparations. Says here, whereas scholars have estimated that the United States benefited from 222,505,049 hours of forced labor between 1619 and the end of slavery.
You sure it wasn't 249, 250 hours? Yeah.
Which would be valued at $97 trillion today. Okay, so that's what we're after here. Whereas if the United States closed racial gaps for black people in the areas of housing, education, wages, and investment 20 years ago, 16 trillion could have been added to the economy, right?
Oh yeah.
So, and again, I think not to get too into the details with the resolution, but it is worth those of you who are interested, House Resolution 414 to go, because Norm and I have been talking about these things for several years now. I think in particular, I attended a CLE that was hosted by a law school here local to me that was exploring the constitutionality of reparations, because it is acknowledged that there is no legal justification under the Constitution at present. There's no precedent that would authorize this. It is a very exploratory regime. And it is a consolidation of power. It treats races as monoliths. It treats everyone who has a skin color of white as an oppressor. And it treats anybody who has a slightest bit of melanin in their skin as part of the oppressed class. And more narrowly than that, it treats anybody who is known to be capital B black as being entitled, by virtue of their presence here within the borders of the United States, is entitled to those who were born hundreds of years after any of this, to those people's alleged money and value. So it's it belies the economic realities of what we're dealing with. It belies any notion that this would shear our republic into a million tattered pieces. And I think we've talked about people who have said that, that they're fine with that, right? That it would making race relations more caustic. They're okay with that. All of that is baked into this pie. But I am really interested in continuing to sort of trace those sight lines of what is perhaps the going to lead the charge in terms of a constitutional argument in favor of race-based transfer payments. I agree with you when we were talking about Eagle Pass, Norm. What came to mind is Mark Meckler and Convention of the States. It seems to me that these two issues in tandem, the issue of reparations and the issue of immigration, perhaps embody the best foundation for to mobilize a Convention of the States, right? And before and beyond.
Let's shift to our third topic of the day, because I think there's a thematic resonance here, and that is the issue of so-called Chevron deference. Certiorari has been granted, and there will soon be arguments in a case involving a narrow question of law, and there is a fisheries law. I can't remember the name of the agency that administers it, that permits the United States government to place on a boat an observer to assure compliance with the law, as the boat travels off the waters of the United States. And what's more, it compels people on the boat, the owners of the boat, to pay for the federal observer. And never mind claims about takings and all that other stuff. That's not the issue presented before the Supreme Court. The question before the Supreme Court is whether the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Commerce has the authority to enact such a regulation. And you'll say, from a constitutional perspective, well, did Congress pass that law? No. So where did the law come from? Well, there are laws. Laws are passed by Congress, and then there are rules. Rules are enacted by administrative agencies. if you're a guy on the street, it doesn't much matter whether it's a rule or a law. If it takes something, if it infringes on your liberty, that's the government acting. And so let's say you're a member of that person, you own that boat, and you're questioning. Wait a minute, what gives the secretary? What gives the United States government the power to tax me in this form? And so I want to challenge that. So you bring the challenge to court, and under the Chevron doctrine, a precedent from the United States Supreme Court, the courts give deference to administrative agencies. Now, the question presented in this case is somewhat nuanced. There's a doctrine in the law called we've talked before about the creation of the administrative state, about the need for administrative agencies to step in, acquire expertise in an area that they have been delegated power to govern by or regulate by the United States Congress. And so if Congress has given the Department of Commerce a broad power to regulate fisheries, let's say, or commerce in fish off the coast, that's a broad power. Now, you could say, well, Congress doesn't have the power to delegate its lawmaking function. This is a theory in constitutional law called the non-delegation doctrine. It was litigated extensively in the area of the Great Depression. It comes up from time to time now. But the law of the land right now, like it or leave it, is that Congress has a broad power to delegate administrative responsibilities to agencies. What happens when agencies acting within that power assert an authority that is nowhere in the grant of power? Have they exceeded their authority and therefore behaved in an unlawful manner? There are those who argue that's a question for the courts to determine. But under the Chevron doctrine, when a congressional grant of power is silent, the courts defer to administrative agencies to enact regulations necessary to accomplish their objectives. And this is called Chevron deference. And so cases before the United States Supreme Court right now are intending to challenge Chevron deference and say, when the congressional grant of power is silent, people haven't consented to have some administrator they never voted for and can't vote out of office make rules deciding they got to pay for an observer on their boat to watch them do their work. That's just crazy. And so Mike spotted, and a number of amicus briefs have been filed in support of this claim before the Supreme Court, one of them by a group called Strive Asset Management. And Strive brings an interesting perspective to this because they're saying.
Do you remember anything else relevant about Strive Asset Management?
Isn't that I might, but you do, so tell us.
Yeah, so that's Vivek's.
I wondered if it was Vivek's.
Yeah, that is Vivek's capital management company that he co-founded, and the thesis, the investment thesis behind that is contra the established order of Wall Street. That is, it rejects DEI and it rejects ESG, and its mandate is to ensure that it is rejecting what is known as stakeholder capitalism in all of its forms, such that investors, private investors, are not investing indirectly or by proxy in policies and in regulations and in cultural shifts that they do not themselves underwrite or agree with, right? Which is largely happening in American boardrooms all over the country with the Fortune 500.
And Strive's petition for petition, an amicus curiae brief is a friend of the court brief. It's a party with an interest in a case or controversy before the court, and they go on to say that when you have financial regulators looking at the with authority over investment devices or financial instruments, if you lead regulators alone without without a specific grant of power, and they start applying this equity, social, I don't even know what ESG stands for, and if they start applying all this crap about stakeholder capitalism into the regulation of finance, what we're going to have is unelected people telling of the investors that they have to behave in a certain way independent of any grant of congressional power. And it calls into question Chevron deference. I think it's a very unique argument and a very compelling argument, Mike. Thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Yeah, I agree. And I always, this is somewhere that I really, I think I sort of gravitate naturally to, the economic, the economy's intersection with law, or economics and their intersection with law, business and transactional work, is what I do on a day-to-day basis. So while Norm is, doing what I think arguably much more noble, um, my understanding of the transactional anatomy of small businesses, medium-sized businesses, et cetera, and those that run them is integral to my being able to do what I do well. And so seeing a company like Strive submit an amicus brief that and what I do also has to negotiate on a day-to-day basis this administrative state that we're talking about, right? Regulatory agencies that are established by and through congressional acts, and staffed by people that, staffed by attorneys, staffed by all sorts of people that are responsible for not only enforcing rules, but in many cases, drafting new rules, revising rules, interpreting their own rules, oftentimes not setting forth procedures for how the rules that they are enforcing and drafting are applied internally or negotiated internally, right? And these all implicate, like, why do we care, Mike? Because these all implicate your rights of due process at a certain point. If you're an entrepreneur or a landowner, or you encounter the regulatory apparatus anywhere in your day-to-day life, your property interests, your liberty interests, et cetera, are implicated necessarily by unelected bureaucrats who often do not have a subject matter expertise in the underlying regulation being applied to you to restrict your movement, your transactions, your indulging in commerce or otherwise. So I love seeing Strive Asset Management actually put something in the court record that will help other people see. And I see it as marketing material, quite frankly, and I'm not even mad at that, Norm, right? I read this as if, like, yeah, you guys are really sort of, doing a whole lot of ball handling here, to take it out of a basketball context. You're doing a lot of ball handling just to show off, but I think that it works. I think that in this case,
I think it does. And to kind of wrap up, where we've covered 3 different topics today, but they all, let's kind of use the metaphor we began with today. You're looking at this orb floating in space from a distance, and you're getting closer and closer to Earth, and you begin to identify a North American continent, and you see patterns uniting the people, the 300 million people living in the United States, such that they are able to more or less cooperate, more or less get along, more or less create stable expectations and a life worth living for more or less all of them. And the more or less clause in each of those clauses, expression in each of those clauses, was doing a lot of work there. But what makes it work is the rule of law, and so we have inflection points where in the United States there's active debates about the scope of the rule. Who's got the power to determine what's going on at a border when a border is being overwhelmed? Is it the federal or state? Who's got the power to determine what to do with the vagaries of history? Does the federal government have the ability to say to those individuals, we're going to look back 400 years and you're going to pay to make people today feel better for things they suffered, or their generation, their progenitors suffered and passed on to them, presumably through some legacy of quote unquote oppression? With respect to the need to regulate complex areas of the economy, Congress gives an agency power, but does it give power to do whatever it wants to do when issues that Congress didn't consider come up? These are fundamental questions. And, earlier in the week, we were criticized as having TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, because I don't like Donald Trump as a person. Sorry about that. And I said, the issue isn't really Donald Trump. The issue is really the broader question of legitimacy in the United States, and he is the canary in the coal mine. We need to be asking ourselves what's going on in the coal mine, such that people are so worked up about Donald Trump. And what's going on are growing pains of a continent becoming crowded. Of a continent that is characterized by ever-increasing complex relations of ever-growing numbers of people who are strangers to one another with different interests, who are competing for limited access to limited resources in an economy, which happens everywhere. This is what these issues are about. And so I don't want to really talk about the personalities of the politicians. I want to talk about, in our representative institutions, what are we comfortable with? Who do we want? And so, notwithstanding the fact, I personally have a bias against more government. I don't think government is the solution to the problems I have in life or the problems my clients have in life. And more government always seems like more complexity, more expense, and more of an opportunity for someone to say, these are the right questions, and we're going to compel you to take the correct answers. I support Trump for president in 2024 because he's anti-government, period. And, you'll say, but, oh, how are you going to create a good society? Oh, how are you going to make a world a better place for our children? I question the role of government as an efficacious actor in those enterprises. And I will support a deregulator. I will support a disruptor who makes room for individuals and local communities to make their decisions for themselves. Fishermen shouldn't be compelled to pay for their observers. Investors shouldn't be compelled to pay for somebody else's vision of a good life. The people of Texas should have the right to secure their own borders for the sake of their own health, education, safety, and welfare. And people of color shouldn't try to hijack the demographic tidal wave that is coming into a benefit society that says to us, pay for them. I mean, it's kind of all ridiculous. And so these are some of the passions that inspire.
This is what I love. One of the
yes.
things I love most. So Dawn and Junior both are on YouTube. And Dawn, thank you. First of all, I love this question, right? How can court cases stop the administrative state from continuing to overreach? Seems like an endless problem.
It
Explain.
is.
And it seems like putting a finger in a damn leak. The bureaucratic state has the power. Junior, you ask, so where are those checks and balances we were told about? I bring all of these things to bear because one of the platform issues in the Vivek campaign was what? It was there are 3 branches of government, not 4. And the administrative state has long been regarded in recent memory as the 4th branch of government, right? That unelected bureaucratic apparatus that is entangling, it is spinning a web, and it is entangling all of us without our real knowledge because it exists subsurface, right?
And let me address
or local level.
Let me address Dawn's and Junior's comments. The problem with Chevron deference, the problem with deferring to agencies is it eliminates, Junior, the checks and balances. Dawn, what are the role of courts in this? The role of the Bill of Rights is to serve as a limit on the application of federalism, however applied, a limit on the application of the separation of powers, however applied. And that's why I said earlier that there are 3 pedestals. I put up 4 hands. What's the joke with lawyers? If we could do math, we'd go to medical school. That's why I said there are 3 branches of government. No, that's why I said there are 3 pedestals that support the constitutional structure. Federalism, separation of power, and the Bill of Rights. We didn't really talk about the Bill of Rights today. There wasn't time to get to everything. I did allude to it in the case of the fisheries case by saying, what gives government the power to compel us to pay for a regulator to stand on our boat? Doesn't that amount to an unlawful taking of power? Is that a power that, in violation, of the Fifth Amendment, which has a takings clause? So Dawn, I think the answer is, it is a perpetual struggle. Always. Lord Acton once said that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think the strain that needs to be emphasized in American politics is that power is supposed to reside in the people's hands. And what makes Trump an appealing candidate is he says that over and over again. And he basically says to the government, fuck off. We'll let the people decide these issues. And the people are going to vote for, people are voting for Donald Trump, notwithstanding the various prosecutions and persecutions of him, because they recognize at some level, that there is lawfare. And Junior, you were kind of scornful of us yesterday, saying, "Oh, you're ignoring lawfare." No, we're not ignoring lawfare. It's real, but the courts are open, and anybody with $1 to hire a lawyer can bring an action in there, and then the courts are going to decide what to do with it. So I don't fault Donald Trump's opponents for bringing him into court and trying to bring him down. If you support Trump, support his candidacy, support his efforts to fight these by contributing to his legal fee funds so that he can fight against these in the courts. These institutions exist, and it's where we're supposed to resolve them. I think that what worried me and worries me about Trump is his open defiance of the courts while in court. Promotes disrespect for the courts as an institution, and people who feel disrespected aren't going to stand for it very long. And I don't, if we want violence in the street, we can have it, and maybe we very well may. But we have an institutional structure that has survived strains far worse than anything we've seen thus far in the United States in the last 3 or 4 years. And the institutional structure, I think, is strong enough to withstand the pressure to come. I think when Trump is in court questioning Jean Carroll's motives, questioning why Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, a Democratic contributor, may be contributing to her prosecution of him while he's contributing to Nikki Haley's defense, these are valid questions, and they're political questions that need to be raised. I think we just need to call out the bullshit we see for what it is, but not throw the baby out, so to speak, with the bathwater. The courts still are open. They still work. We still have these institutions in place. There are fractures. It's fraying, but it's never been a perfect unity. And these are all we can offer here, and all we offer on Law and Legitimacy is a look at how these tensions play out in real time. Oh, Dawn, the courts are a joke in these cases. I have zero respect for any of these lawsuits. I'm not saying I have respect for the lawsuits either, but I'm not. If you think the courts are a joke, what's the answer? Where are we going to resolve these disputes? Okay, I'm a lawyer, so accuse me of special pleading. People call me every day. I get emails every day. I want to sue. I want to do this. I want to do that. Take my case. Take my case. Take my case. I look at 90% of the claims that come in here and think they don't have merit. That I understand the frustration that the claimants have, but to walk them into a courtroom would be to walk them into a slaughter. And so we don't take cases that we don't think we can advance. Jean Carroll brought a defamation claim against Donald Trump. A defamation is a recognized tort, and it has been for decades in the United States, maybe centuries. She has every right to bring that claim, and Donald Trump has every right to defend himself. But to call the forum a joke because you don't like Jean Carroll's motives is to suggest that the forum shouldn't be available to you when someone questions your motives. Law is a body of neutral principles that are designed to resolve conflicts in a way that help us live together without violence. And I will subscribe to the rule of law. I will support courts even when I disagree with them, even when I lose respect for some of the things they do, because I don't see an alternative. Brown shirts at night, Kristallnacht, taking out your opponents and putting them in a concentration camp, gassing them. Maybe call the good people of Hamas and ask them to come in and move against your adversaries. That's not society. Society, Latin term, friends, sohai. Strangers become friends under the rule of law. We share common interests and we share common conceptions of right. If we lose those common conceptions of right, and our interests begin to diverge such that we view interactions as a zero-sum game, that's a return to the state of nature. And, Thomas Hobbes once called it. And the life was nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. Without the rule of law, everyone is justified in taking the law into their own hands and getting what they can. Do you really want to live that way? I don't.
I agree, Norm. And it looks like we have a lot of work to do based on these comments, and I welcome that. I'm not shying from that. I don't think that you or I are strangers to work, but it is important to me that we bring as much perspective and as much support for our system of laws and governance as possible through this effort, and that is to also say that we can hold two, on the surface, what may be two countervailing conclusions in our mind at the same time. Two things can be true, right? To Don's point, these cases can appear to be corrupt, right? The cases can appear to be a joke, or the judge or justice, whomever you're looking at. But the problem that we have with that is ultimately, Norm, not to pick on you at all, but I think that the people who are here and who watch this show and listen to you are okay with your relationship and having represented someone like Alex Jones, right? And there is a certain side of our public discourse that would hold the same opinion as one Janet Schmidt, who said the courts are owed the disrespect. The bar and groveling lawyers need to look in the mirror. That same sentiment exists with equal fervor on the other side of that mirror, right? And the issue that we have here is that both sides are losing faith in the system for the other side's transgressions at the same time. And what we are attempting to do here is to at least peel back. And I think the administrative state, the Administrative Procedure Act, those things, Norm, may be a great tool for us to continue using
Yeah.
in that effort in the future. I think that that may be the best way for people to, at least in their own personal life, be able to shine a flashlight on those things in their community that affect them that may have gone long unobserved, and
Well,
start small.
and we'll stay at it. You know, am I an optimist, Junior? Am I lecturing you, Dawn? You're damn right I am. You know, and am I doing so as a form of special pleading, defending my livelihood? Not necessarily. Clarence Darrow got it right. There is no justice in or out of court, but there is no alternative, it seems to me, than to maintain civil society, than to continue to work to support and improve the institutions that all of us rely on. If you decide they're not worthy of your support, make the appeal to heaven that John Locke, talked about. But understand that once you dissolve civil society, you have the same needs you had before civil society was dissolved, and now the responsibility to try to meet those needs. If you don't like the courts, the way they operate, come up with a better alternative to open to people to resolve their disputes. We're all ears. I just don't see one right now.
You can find us here on Monday. And on Monday, as I've got here on the screen, issue number 2 of the LAL newsletter will hit inboxes. So if you're not already subscribed to the newsletter, go to lawpoddaily.com and subscribe. We will have what we're reading. We'll have a new essay or two. We may even have a published episode of long form with one Pete Atkinson that'll go out with that as well. We've got a lot of content sort of in on ice, as they say, and is incumbent on me this weekend to really pull all that together and get it out to you, because Norm is working overtime putting things together for you. Anyway, Norm, any parting wisdom before we get out of here and bid everybody farewell to Monday morning?
Parting wisdom, man. If I had any wisdom at all, I would have offered it to you at hello. Have a good weekend, everyone. Stay safe, stay warm, and remember, it's your republic. What are you going to make of it? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to be responsibly support calls for change?
See you on Monday.